Hey, how's it going? This is Melinda and welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk to you about record labels, the labels that bring back amazing memories, very iconic from record companies. And I know I can only, I can't even scratch the surface when it comes to record labels, record companies. There's so many subsidiaries, affiliations, so many record companies that combine together. And I'm just going to share some of those that stand out to me as ones that I remember from my childhood. Hopefully they will bring back memories for you as well. Some of these records are just iconic because of my vinyl collecting habit and what I enjoy finding. I can see a record that maybe I bought 5 or 10 years ago and I can remember what was going on in my life at the time. Maybe you can have some of those memories as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about one of the biggies, Capitol Records. And of course, Frank Sinatra was on that label, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and it was founded in 1942, and it was known as the house that Nat built. And I'm talking about Nat King Cole. He put out a lot of records on Capitol Records. They sold very well. They helped Capitol Records get established. And of course, here is one example of a Capitol label, black with silver font. But there's more, for my memories, more iconic record labels that I remember. And you don't even have to own a full-size Capitol record to realize and remember iconic record labels. And I'm talking about 45s, like this one from the Beatles. This one is on that orange and yellow swirl label. We can find a lot of Beach Boys records on this same label. So iconic, so memorable. You first generation Beatles and Beach Boys fans, I can only imagine the memories that these bring. And I love collecting them as vinyl. As a vinyl collector and as a Beatles and Beach Boys fan. And also what's very cool is if you become a Beatles fan and you study that, you realize that US pressings are very different from the UK pressings. But if you were a fan of the Beatles in the United States, you loved these albums. The album covers were very different, the track listings were different. And yet this iconic Capitol rainbow label just brings back amazing memories. So I can only imagine what you first generation Beatles fans, what you feel when you see those. I know as a record collector, they bring me tremendous joy as well. So more about Frank Sinatra a little bit later in this video because he was on Capitol Records. But now, let's go ahead and move on to Atlantic. Atlantic labels founded in 1947, and they had iconic artists like Aretha Franklin, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Wilson Pickett, Ray Charles, and of course, Led Zeppelin. And this is probably for me the most iconic record label, the ones that I see that have this red and green label. And of course I know some of the early Led Zeppelin records were on the plum label. I have a Led Zeppelin 3 and an Aretha Franklin record that are on like a teal and green label. They're iconic too. But I really love Chic. They were a great disco band that came out. And I have this record, again, the red and green. Some people say orange, but I say red. And they were a tremendous band. That label brings back so many memories. And of course, also, ACDC was home. Atlantic Records was their home. And they had this tremendous record, one of my favorites. It's a soundtrack for Maximum Overdrive, a cheesy movie that I loved back in the 80s. We get songs like Who Made Who, one of my very favorites. You Shook Me All Night Long, Hell's Bells, Shake Your Foundations, and For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. I love that record, and it is again on this Atlantic red and green label. So now let's go ahead and move on to another very iconic record label, Columbia. And it was founded back in 1889. And there are tremendous artists like Simon and Garfunkel, Dave Brubeck, Louis Armstrong, Bruce Springsteen, Duke Ellington, and of course, an amazing artist. And when I saw him in concert a couple of years ago, he was introduced as Ladies and Gentlemen, Columbia recording artist Bob Dylan. And as a collector, we love to find these old Bob Dylan records on the 2i Columbia label like this. Those are very cool to find. Also, as a record collector, we love to find old records like this Dave Brubeck record. And we like these 6i Columbia record labels. So those are cool. And I do find that these Columbia records, you can have a few little places on them maybe, and they still can sound really, really great. And so I really like that Columbia label. I think they're high quality. The label that brings the most sentimental value to me is another one, and I'll just show this one as an example. This is a reissue of Bob Dylan's greatest hits. And what I really love about it, it comes on this 180 Columbia record label. To me, this one is iconic. Maybe not the one I would look for when it comes to certain pressings, because it's a later reissue usually of some of the records I like to have. But what's so special about it is my mom had a copy of the Andy Williams Christmas record. It's got a red background. She had a reissue. That's what that record album label looked like. So when I see it, it reminds me of Christmas in my childhood. And I don't know of any better memories than being a kid at Christmas time. So I love the Columbia label. I love the artists, and those record labels as a collector and even as a young child bring back wonderful memories. So now let's go ahead and talk about the Reprise label. It was founded back in 1960 by Frank Sinatra, and he had important artists like Bing Crosby, Rosemary Clooney. He had Gordon Lightfoot. Graham Parsons was on the Reprise label, as well as Jimi Hendrix. And this is a record that I really love having. I found this in Colorado, in Fort Collins. My husband and I, during the pandemic, had to live in Colorado. His company needed him in Colorado at the time, and they didn't really want him flying. So we stayed there for a few months and got to live in Colorado, a beautiful state. We lived in Loveland, but I fell in love with a little city called Fort Collins. And at Christmas time, it was the most beautiful little city, all these beautiful Christmas lights, and I just loved it. And I found this record. This is Gordon Lightfoot, If You Could Read My Mind. And I found it at a bar/record store. I just went in there to look at records, and I think these Reprise records, especially these Gordon Lightfoot records, sound absolutely incredible. So I love having this. Now, there is what they call a tricolor version of the Reprise label. This Gordon Lightfoot record is that classic copper tan record label that I really enjoy as well. So the Reprise label was amazing, and I love seeing these iconic record labels. So let's now talk about the record label that was short-lived but made a huge mark. And I'm talking about Casablanca Records. This was a huge record label that came out. They almost didn't make it. They almost went out of business almost nearly from the start. They were founded in 1973 by Neil Bogart. And as we said back during when I was talking about Capitol Records and the house that Nat built, Casablanca was the house that Kiss built. They were the first band they signed to Casablanca Records. And it took them a few tries. They put out a few records that did not sell. Casablanca was on the brink. They almost went bankrupt. But that fourth record was Kiss Alive, and boom, it took off and saved Casablanca and saved Kiss as well. And they had a beautiful friendship for a very long time after that. This is my favorite Casablanca record label. It has like this smoky guy on it. Very, very cool. I love the blue label. But it's not the one that brings back the most memories for me as a child. So Kiss was probably the most well-known band from Casablanca. But you cannot discount others that came along. Donna Summer, she was in that disco era and she sold a ton of records for Casablanca as well. If you don't own any Donna Summer records, you should definitely own Greatest Hits on the Radio, Volumes 1 and 2. It is like being in an old 1970s dance club when you listen to it. It just goes from one track to the next, and it is fantastic. And this one is on what I remember more, this tan Casablanca label. And I had the 45 of I Was Made for Loving You back when I was a kid. It was on the tan label. So that one is the one that brings back the most memories. But we can't forget artists like Parliament. They were on Casablanca. Thank you, Steve Carlson, for giving me this record. So nice. And also, you know you loved them. You just don't want to admit it. I was a kid, so I had a good excuse. I loved the Village People. And yes, they were on the Casablanca label. I have great memories of being in Evansville, Indiana at a mall. And there was Washington Square Mall had a store called Records, Tapes, and Tickets. And my mom, I can remember one day, she bought the 45s of YMCA and Macho Man for me, my sister, and me. We were so ecstatic. So I love seeing this old, iconic record label by Casablanca. And really love those. So next up is another label that brings back a lot of amazing memories, and maybe the record label I owe the biggest thanks to, Warner Brothers. They were founded in 1958, and they had Fleetwood Mac, Black Sabbath, Prince, and of course, Van Halen. So I love Van Halen. I love this palm tree label. Most iconic for me. And it was really, really wonderful. Now, some of you might have memories of a different Warner Brothers label. Black Sabbath, when they first came out, was on an army green label. You can also imagine and think about the Alice Cooper records that were on this label as well. And what a great memory. So the palm tree label, though, that's the one that is most iconic for me. And even though I love Van Halen and I have those records and they are wonderful, Fleetwood Mac, the Rumors album was on that palm tree label. The artist that really brings me back is, you're gonna laugh, but Shaun Cassidy. You know, he was kind of the Justin Bieber of the mid-70s. He was Davy Cassidy's little brother, and I had a t-shirt with this picture on it. My sister had a t-shirt with this picture on it, and he was the first person I ever got to see in concert, although I don't really remember a lot about that concert because I was so young. But we had records by Shaun Cassidy on this palm tree record label, and really, really love that. I have a memory of asking my mom one time if she would pick up a record for me that had the song Hey Deanie on it. And she was going to the mall that day, and she said, you know, if I can afford it, I will buy it for you. And I remember getting home from school that day and running into the house and asking her, Mom, did you get the record with Hey Deanie by Shaun Cassidy on it? And her saying, yes, I got it for you, honey. Her handing it to me, and it was the 45 of Hey Deanie. She was so happy. She had this big smile on her face. And I immediately was sad and almost cried. I was so disappointed. When I said I wanted the record with Houdini on it, I wanted this record, Shaun Cassidy's Born Late album. I didn't know the title was Born Late. That might have helped, but I was just a kid. And I really regret, and I wish I could change it. I wish I would have just been outwardly grateful for her bringing the 45 to me and giving it to me, but instead I was disappointed. I wanted the full album. But, you know, back in that time, my mom was a single mom. She didn't have a lot of money. We didn't get full albums. We got 45s. And I just feel bad because she probably had to splurge a little to get that 45 for me, and yet I wasn't happy. So I wish I could change that memory. But for the most part, that Palm Tree Memory by Warner Brothers brings back great memories. So now let's move on to another one, very, very iconic to me. It was a record label called RSO. It was founded in 1973, and it stood for Robert Stigwood Organization. And this is the iconic record that I remember most being on that record label, the Grease soundtrack. And I remember saving up birthday money and still not having enough to be able to swing buying this record album. So my mom had to spot me $1.50, but check it out. Here is that iconic RSO label. Most of you probably remember it too, from Cream, Eric Clapton, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and most importantly, the Bee Gees. And the Bee Gees really were helpful with RSO. Hurtful and helpful, because there was a movie that came out called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It had the Bee Gees in it, it had Peter Frampton, and it totally bombed. The soundtrack bombed. They lost so much money from that record. But thankfully, the Bee Gees also, around that same time, put out this album called Spirits Having Flown, with great songs on here like Too Much Heaven and Tragedy. This sold so many records and was so important and so successful that it really helped RSO take on that loss of the Sgt. Pepper record that was such a bomb. So Bee Gees kind of helped out the Bee Gees. Also, there was a huge lawsuit between RSO and the Bee Gees, maybe the largest in history, and it settled for an undisclosed amount of money, but Bee Gees stayed with RSO until RSO dissolved. And so I really love having this record. I love that I still have this Bee Gees merchandise form. This one was in the record that I bought. Again, RSO. That's a wonderful memory for me when I see this iconic record. I can still remember going to a friend's house who had some of those records and having the Grease soundtrack myself. So now I want to talk to you about maybe the most iconic and most memorable record label for me personally, because what I'm going to show you is my first memory, period. I don't remember anything else before this, but I was 3 years old, and this is a copy now. This is a reissue from Elemental Music. This is Sonny & Cher, All I Ever Need Is You. But back in the day when I was 3 years old in 1973, I accidentally left this album cover out in the rain and got in trouble for doing that. And it was on this iconic record label, Kapp. And yes, there's earlier versions of the Kapp label that are probably iconic to a lot of you. Kapp was established in 1954 from David Kapp. He had worked with Decca, and he worked with RCA, and he started his own label back in 1954. This is one of the later records from that label. And here's another one. And after that album cover from Sonny & Cher was destroyed, I kept that Sonny & Cher record with this Cher solo debut on Kapp. I remember thinking this picture of her was really weird, but loving this one. She had perfect eyelashes, perfect cheekbones, beautiful hair, and her solo record was on this Kapp label. So this Kapp label is especially important to me. It's one of the only memories I have from when I was living in Santa Claus, Indiana, and I was only 3 years old. So that is the power of an album cover and album labels, when you see them and you can remember them from your childhood, even as young as 3 years old. So that is the video. Please tell me the record labels that are so iconic to you. Share your stories, your memories. I really want to hear them. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, the subscribe button, the notification bell. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.